All right, we're live. Okay, so hey everybody, welcome to Progressive Decoupling, a case study with PRI. We're going to do a very high-level discussion around Public Radio International's new technological stack that Four Kitchens and myself were personally involved with building. And we're going to talk through some of the organizational requirements that facilitated or necessitated this the technical stack that we built out, and we're going to talk through some of the challenges and some of the really good things that came out of this project. My name is Patrick Coffey. I'm a senior JavaScript engineer at Four Kitchens. It's weird for me to be at a Drupal meetup, but I also do Drupal things. So, yeah. Who here has heard of the term decoupled Drupal? Just raise your hand. All right, so everybody, basically. Yeah, so it's been a really hot topic for the last, 5 years at every DrupalCon, at every Drupal camp. They always have a few decoupled talks. In 2015, Dries wrote a blog post entitled "The Future of Decoupled Drupal," in which he outlined several ways to approach decoupling and sort of what it actually means and what it is. And it really is just a fancy word that kind of refers to the process of migrating from a monolithic CMS such as Drupal or WordPress, Drupal counterpart, to an API-driven distributed architecture where you have some sort of system that serves structure, machine understandable, readable code, aka an API, and then you have something that kind of consumes that and then uses that data to render user-friendly interface. Or in some cases, it's not even on the web. It might be, Amazon Alexa or something like that. But yeah, basically, decoupling refers to breaking the presentation, whatever that looks like, away from content, how it's structured, how you create it, and how it's formed, and that sort of thing. And one of the concepts that Dries outlined in his talk, or I'm sorry, in his post, was this idea of progressive decoupling. So there are lots of websites out there, lots of Drupal sites, way more WordPress sites. Actually, I think something like 30% of the web is WordPress, something crazy like that. And a lot of these are monolithic, and many companies that have built their websites and their web presence on these technologies are sort of looking to escape the monolithic approach because they're growing way beyond, what their technology sort of supports. And this is really challenging because if you just try to build a full API that supports everything that you need to support, and then a full front end and a full editorial experience, that's a significant amount of work, and that's going to take a lot of time. For you to sort of implement all of those different pieces and have them work together and then flip a big switch and go live, right? That's a lot. So Dries talked about this idea of progressive decoupling, which is another fancy word, but what it really just means, or it's two fancy words, but what they mean is basically that you would decouple, or you would approach this distributed architecture one component at a time, one thing at a time. And the component or thing is a very relative sort of term. It could be the comment section in your Drupal site, or it could be a whole series of pages or content types in your Drupal site. And so today we're going to talk about how PRI has approached this, why they've approached it, and how we sort of began to solve some of these problems for them. So we're going to talk about PRI and the timeline that we had to do all these things and give a little bit of history and context as to why this was important and why it was good for us to approach this sort of architecture. And we're going to talk about what we've done, give a very high-level introduction to some of the technologies that we've used in this process, and then we're going to talk about some of the challenges and the good things that sort of came out of this project, and then open it up for questions and answers, hopefully answers. There are lots of questions. So Public Radio International, or PRI, is a global nonprofit media company that is focused on the intersection of journalism and engaging people to affect positive change in the world. Their mission is to serve audiences as a distinctive content source for information, insights, and cultural experiences that are essential to living in our very diverse and interconnected world. It's very important to note that PRI is not NPR or APM or PRX or any of the other public radio 3 character things that you might hear. Those are friendly competitors. PRI is just sort of one of those, so don't get confused. PRI also has a bunch of different radio stations, so it's not just what you would find on PRI.org. That site itself has probably 60 RSS feeds that power all sorts of different things. So it's much larger than just what you might see today, which kind of plays into some of the decisions that we've made. So PRI has been on Drupal for 5 years, which is quite a while in my estimation. They built the replacement to their old site in Drupal 7, yeah, it was great. The site kind of looked like this for about 5 years, and that was about it. It worked really well. It solved their needs. Hey, Chris. Yeah, this is what it looked like for about 5 years. However, just like I was mentioning previously when talking about Dries' blog post, PRI received a bunch of unexpected growth as a result to moving to Drupal, right? So they had this new platform that enabled them to write content in volumes that were much higher than before. And they were also, like I was saying, creating tons and tons of RSS feeds to publish content to other consumers and sources. And so their site began to collect a lot of different visitors. They went from 100,000 visitors a month to something like I think 1 million uniques a month within a year of going onto that platform, and then that led up to 2 million and beyond. And the traffic peaked, as you might expect, during the election cycle, the last election cycle. But then Facebook decided to stop making news as public on the platform, which kind of put a damper on some things. So it's been a little bit, I guess, stagnant. It kind of decreased a little bit after that whole process went through. However, PRI stayed the same, which is it all ties back. Site stack. It's not very scalable. When they because they were sweating bullets at that point, which is not a healthy thing. When you get a bunch of publication and you get visibility, you want to be confident that your technical stack can serve that demand. The process of actually adding content to the site became extremely sluggish. Uploading files, saving nodes, that became just basically an extreme frustration for editors because not only was Drupal serving all this traffic and it wasn't really set up and configured correctly to be able to do so adequately, it was also having to accept rights from all these editors. And you would end up having these problems where, for instance, there'd be an administrative rush at the end of the day where everybody would be trying to get their stories in for the day and trying to sort of like wrap things up. Our version, our developers' version of putting in a PR, right? So they would, a bunch of them would start saving nodes and making new versions of content all at the same time, and people would start hitting the site and it would just go down. And this was just their reality for a while. And additionally, as this technical thing, this monolith grew, adding new features just basically made things worse and made it more complex. And even in some cases, when you try to introduce performance enhancements, it would cause regressions in other areas so it was becoming a bit unmaintainable and a bit unstable. So PRI's answers to this problem a couple of years ago was to build a custom platform. And they approached the idea, like I was saying earlier, about just making an API and making some consumers for that API, an administrative application, and a front end that could be presented to their users and show their users that data. They knew they needed to make some changes, and they decided to abandon Drupal entirely and go the route of building this custom stack on their own. And during this process, they essentially ignored the Drupal 7 site. It kind of just stayed the way that it was, had the performance issues that it had, and editors were really frustrated. The site went down way too regularly, and those issues still existed. So there was a sense of urgency to build this new platform and to move on to it. So they did a bunch of work on it, actually, and I think the most impressive work is in the front end, the administrative front end that they built out. They built a custom front end that allows them to actually sort of like in a very specific and managed way manage their content. And it's a very customized approach to what their editors need to be able to do the things that they need to do, which is phenomenal and great. However, that was not reality. The custom stack that they had built, it was becoming clear that it wasn't going to be finished in time for really anything. And the management team, their leaders began to kind of question what was going on. Why weren't they seeing progress? What was happening? Their Drupal 7 on one hand was staying stagnant. Nothing was happening there. And then on this new platform, they weren't really seeing any progress. They kind of put the stops on things and said we need to evaluate our process, the roles in our technicals, team, and all the different things that are involved with our approach to developing software. And in addition to doing some restructuring, they contacted For Kitchens again. We had worked with them previously, but they decided to talk to us again and see what we could do for them. And they asked that we audit the custom platform that they had built to see whether or not it was a viable option for them moving forward. I personally worked on this as well. We went through and we did a very thorough and very in-depth audit of every part of the stack that they had built out. Obviously, the most impressive was the thing I just showed you, was the administrative interface that they built out that actually was pretty nifty. But the rest of it was very, very inviable, I would say. It was in a state where it was approaching levels of unmaintainability and unextendability that you would expect out of a really old application like the Drupal app they were operating on, but it hadn't even launched yet. So there were a lot of things that they had faced as a tech team that they didn't have the leadership or maybe the time or the resources or the skills to sort of navigate. And this really is not saying that their tech team was doing a bad job. It's just to say that, like, actually building API-driven content sites that are supposed to support all the things that PRI supports is actually a difficult set of problems. It's not an easy thing to approach, and doing so in such a way that you can just flip a switch and have everything work. It's almost a dreamland. That's just a huge thing to sort of to think about and to talk about. And they spent 2 years working on this, talked to us, and we kind of confirmed a lot of their hunches that maybe this was not the best way to go forward. So we needed a new path, and we needed a new thing that would help us, get PRI into a place where they weren't plagued by these performance issues and all these things that they were dealing with, and they were really frustrated with Drupal for making them deal with these things. So we needed a path forward from that solved a lot of the problems that had become apparent during the process of them building that custom application that they were working on for 2 years. And so For Kitchens, on top of doing an audit for them and looking at the custom application, we provided some options for them going forward based off of what we thought was right, and we gave them sort of an idea as to how many resources it would take to do each one. And those options were to make the custom platform viable, so finish development, restructure major portions of it, and actually fix it so that it would be able to flip the switch and go live. Obviously expensive. You're basically in their case, we would be starting from ground zero in a lot of ways, because we'd have to sort of wipe away some of the things that had become crufty even before being launched at an alpha phase, and we'd have to start over and start thinking about things from a structurally correct perspective and architecting them to be viable for the future. So big undertaking, lots of money, lots of time, not an easy thing to do. There are companies that have a lot more money than PRI that try to do this and fail and try again and eventually get it right. PRI doesn't have that kind of resources. They're public radio. They are a phenomenal company. They make great content, but unfortunately they don't have just giant amounts of funding. That's just the reality that they have to deal with. We also scoped out the idea of upgrading to Drupal 8, because Drupal 8 does solve a lot of the issues that I think they were plagued by eventually as time went on. And the Drupal 7 instance, not easy either. Drupal 8 is a completely different system. You have to rebuild all of your front-end stuff in Twig and all these other environments. You also have to rethink your content model such that you're solving problems in your old content model, because there are always problems in content models. And then also writing a migration that takes all this content from the old site and puts it in the new and recreate all these views and all these things. So it's not an easy thing to approach as well. It's a lot easier than a custom platform, I'll give you that, but it's not a simple process, especially when PRI is approaching this from the perspective of having already thought that they had a solution and having already paid for it. So we're dealing with, like, what can we do now with the smallest amount of money? So still kind of a difficult option. The third option was decoupling Drupal 7, and that actually didn't turn out to look as expensive, and we'll talk more about that because that's actually the route that we went down to. And then the fourth option was to actually not decouple Drupal 7, but to actually continue developing on it and to fix its problems and to work through its issues, and sort of try to make it stand on its own 2 feet. On top of all these paths, our first recommendation was that they actually go through and do a lot of that fourth option, fix the existing site, because you can't continue to grow as a company and as a website if your technical stack is just failing whenever you have traffic growth, right? That's a core problem. So you have to sort of solve for that first. And we actually did end up going with the third option of decoupling on Drupal 7. So all of these things that we needed to fix could have affected the API and all these other things that we were going to build in Drupal 7. So we needed to resolve these issues. With all these options on the table, PRI kind of took a few weeks, and they went through and thoroughly read all the things that were written down and weighed the options and talked to the stakeholders, and they made some decisions. So from a technical perspective, they needed their stack to be fast, stable, and allow for future flexibility, right? So they wanted to actually be able to take high amounts of load, return pages in under 10 seconds, which is something that actually happened on the old site, and then allow for them to distribute their content to new areas and to new verticals that they hadn't previously been able to do or to distribute to. And in addition to that, because of that 2-year period where nothing happened, presumably because as far as stakeholders are concerned, they look at a website, and if it's the same thing that they see, 2 years past the date, that's no progress. They see no progress at all. It doesn't matter if you're behind the scenes working on something incredible. They don't see any progress, and stakeholders oftentimes are involved in allocating resources, right? So you sort of need to have them on board. So one of the things that was very important is to show them that on top of building something that's structurally sound and good and planning for their future, and in terms of being able to serve higher levels of traffic and being more flexible, we also needed to make it incremental so that they could actually see changes and see progress, without having this incredible amount of time invested into this thing that may or may not go live now because they spent so much time working on the previous architecture. So we needed a quick win, and we needed a real win. We needed it to actually be faster, to be more stable, and we needed it to be more flexible. So we did decide to decouple to Drupal 7. Now, obviously, like I mentioned previously, there was a lot to do in the existing site. We needed to fix issues that were just piling up, errors. We migrated them off of a custom sort of weirdly managed set of instances on Google Cloud. Yeah, Google Cloud Services. I don't know. I feel like they've renamed that product. Every time I say the word Google, it just means everything. So Google Cloud, that's their like AWS competitor. So we moved them off of that onto Pantheon, which, funny enough, Pantheon actually moved from Rackspace to Google Cloud shortly afterwards. So we didn't actually make any real infrastructural changes, but all the things that Pantheon brings to the table in terms of instance management and all that stuff is absolutely phenomenal, and it really allowed them to scale up their site and to make it a lot more robust, because all of a sudden they have servers that will stand up against traffic, and they can spin up new instances, and they don't have to worry about it as a tech team. So that was a great thing that for them, and it was a complicated process, but we got it done, and we also fixed a bunch of issues in their views, their panels, all sorts of things that were just kind of sitting there, causing things to be slower and causing other problems in the system. So we did that for a few months last fall, and then we approached decoupling Drupal 7. So what we've actually done, we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about, no more historical context. We're going to talk about what we actually dove into, because this is actually really recent stuff. So if you remember, we needed a real quick win. We needed to be able to actually show progress for the time and the resources that we were expending on this project, right? So what we ended up doing was building a full API in Drupal 7 that was completely compliant to a very specific spec I'll talk about in a minute, and supported all CRUD operations. And then we approached building a front-end system, and we replaced one page, the home page. And that gave us some very unique opportunities to not only show progress to the stakeholders. Hey, here's a new homepage. You haven't had a new one for probably 5 years, 6 years, maybe more. It also allowed us to do so in a very technically approachable way. So we spent a lot of time and it was a lot of hard work, but we put together an architectural foundation for a fully distributed system. But we only replaced one page, and that allowed us to do so really carefully, to put our toes in the water before we jumped in, and to solve different problems that we encounter that you really just don't know you have to solve until you do it. So it was a great way to sort of approach this, and I think it worked out really well. So as I mentioned, we wanted to redo the homepage, and obviously, when you're redoing the homepage, you just don't want to build the old design right in a new system. That's not progress either. The stakeholders don't care if it's built in React or Vue or Perl. They really don't care if it looks the same. It is the same to them. So we had to redesign it, and in doing so, we kind of did redesign the whole site. We simplified it in a lot of ways and solved some UX issues. But the homepage itself was a completely different application. It was supported by a completely different stack, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But yeah, homepages are actually kind of dead if you look at it. They don't represent massive amounts of traffic. Usually people don't go to PRI.org to get to PRI's content. They see it in Reddit, Twitter, Googling, things like, political things or whatever. So, homepages are kind of, they don't represent a huge amount of traffic. It's actually less than 10%. PRI, probably more around 5. So it was a great way to replace something that was still critical and still very important, but also not super, super risky, right? So that was why we chose that. And this is the first iteration of the redesign for the homepage. If you just go back a couple of pages, you'll see this guy. Yeah, that's the old one. This is the new one that Brandon actually designed. The person that designed these slides actually designed this. And I forgot to do this, but I will give a huge shout out to Brandon Hunt. He is the product owner on this project that I'm talking about, and he designed all these slides for a talk for Twin Cities. And we kind of worked on the talk a little bit together, but he came up with the look and feel. So big thanks to him, and he is awesome. So you should follow him on Twitter. But yeah, this is the first iteration of the redesign for the homepage that we came up with. And this went through many iterations with the team, editorial team, and so on and so forth. And we finally arrived to some small changes, but this is the general idea. And we didn't really change it a whole lot, actually. It was pretty consistent with what this is when it launched. And so the first step for doing this, for approaching building this in a new system, was to build an API. Right, because we could just rebuild that in Drupal 7, but that doesn't really accomplish many goals for us, because it doesn't give us any sort of progress in terms of solving the performance issues that we have, in terms of making something that's more future viable and sort of actually progressing in a technological sense. It might look like we are, but it's kind of, it wouldn't be. So we built a full RESTful API using a tool by the name of RESTful, which is a Drupal module that sort of provides an approach to creating API resources in Drupal 7. It's written by the same person that wrote the JSON API module for Drupal 8, Matteo. He's a great guy. He works at Lullabot. And so the system is not similar to the JSON API, but it is, it's not congruent, but it is similar. I'll say that. So yeah, we proceeded to build out this RESTful API, and we adhered to the JSON API spec, which, how many of you have ever heard of the JSON API spec? So a few people. It's a very, very strict specification that determines how you should talk to a computer over a JSON API. And it has sort of built-in approaches to things like sparse field parsing, filtering, sorting, stuff like that. And who here has heard of GraphQL? So, but the same amount of people. It's kind of like that, but a little bit more obtuse and harder to use in terms of the client actually doing the queries. And it's harder to normalize if you're into that. But yeah, so we didn't just build an API resource for the front page. We needed to build the entire API for all of their content, and we needed to support all CRUD operations. And I think we got most of the way there with the CRUD operations. We certainly support all read operations. And so this is a big challenge, and we got it done. And we then moved on to building a front end that consumed this API. And that was the part where we actually need to create something that's really robust, we need to set in place patterns and architectures that allow them to be successful at building out the entire front end. Because remember, we're only doing the home page, so we could easily build this one-off thing, but we don't want to do that. We want to build just a home page and a full application that's ready to allow them to build out all the other pages that they want to build. So a lot of architectural work went into that. The first sort of thing that we approached in this process was the idea that they're now going distributed. We should be very specific about how we do that, how we go about building consumers to their API. And one of the things that became obvious is that if they're going to indeed build out an administrative application and a front-end application, and who knows, maybe a mobile application in the future, they would need a consistent way to talk about their design language, right? And a very common way to do so on the web these days is to use component-based design. And we did build the new front end in React. So we used an application by the name of Storybook, and we used a sort of organization pattern called Atomic Design to sort of create these different individual components, and then sort of a series of components constructed to make bigger components, or atoms, molecules, organisms, that sort of idea. And that's sort of what it looks like. This is a screenshot of a Storybook instance in which we host these things. It's not really hosting. Basically, we built a node module that exports all these things, like the donate button, search forms, stuff like that. And that allows us to take that package and import it in other packages, and then use those components in different environments freely. The Storybook instance is kind of a consumer of the NPM module. It's in the same repository because that's convenient, but it basically just imports the same components and puts them into this nice UI, which actually is very convenient. Who here has heard of Storybook or used it before? Cool. So it's really phenomenal, actually, because it creates this staging, this graphical staging environment for your components, in which you can actually see them working and operating. You should definitely still write full automated tests and everything, probably snapshot tests too, but this gives you a visual way to see what your components look like. And then if I were able to open up these different sections on the screenshot, you would see that you can basically kind of see how these components can be composed to create larger things. And it's a playground where you don't have to connect to data APIs. You don't have to sort of do any of that stuff. You could just create these components. And Storybook comes with a lot of great tools, one of which is this accessibility tool. We actually did a full accessibility audit with this tool and identified a number of issues with their color scheme. So we modified their color scheme so that it would be so that it would have more contrast and be more accessible to people that have different types of color blindness, as one example. But there were other things that we needed to do to make sure that our application was accessible, such as like making sure our ARIA roles are correct and so on and so forth. So tools like these are very incredible, and they make the process of approaching things like that are kind of abstract and sometimes very difficult, like accessibility, really simple. It just tells you what to do. It's like, hey, this color is too light. People can't see this on some screens, or some people won't be able to see this. There's a blog post called PRI.org, React Lessons Learned, by my colleague, Evan Wilhite, who developed a lot of these components in conjunction with me and the rest of the team. And he goes into detail about how this stuff works and how he sort of approached architecting this stuff. So I'd suggest that you take a look at that if you want to get more information on how to do this. But basically, Storybook is a great playground, and it's also a great place to create a robust set of components that you want to use in your different front ends. So we have a component library, but we need a place to put those components. We need a place where we can query the API that we've built for data, pull that data in, denormalize it, process it, massage it down into something that's consumable, and then we can pass it to those components that we were just looking at, right? So one of the things that we wanted to support was server-side rendering. And there's a really neat little framework by the name of Next.js. It's by the people that run Site, which also runs now, now.sh. believe. Next is a very, very small framework. It's very light-handed, and all it does is it provides you a basic approach to creating pages, routes, and fetching data in an async way for React applications. And it also provides server-side rendering, so that's kind of a plus, although doing that in React 16 is actually not that hard. So we used Next as a way to sort of solve some problems that would have really kind of caused us to have to write a bigger Webpack file. But Next, they allow you to override Webpack configuration. So really, it's a framework in the sense that it gives you some free things, but it's not in the sense that you can override every part of it if you want to at any time. So very light-handed, but it comes with some freebies that we wanted to use. And in this Next-based application, what we did was we just built out these mechanisms that basically did requests to the API, ingested the incoming data, denormalized it into something that was exactly what the components wanted to get from the API, and then it constructed the homepage. Yeah, and this was pretty straightforward. Once we had the components and once we had the API, pulling those things together and making them work together was actually not too hard. We did deploy this onto Zeit servers on now.sh, and that's where PRI's homepage is pulled from now. Actually, it was very simple, and we have a PRI Bender, Futurama Bender. We have a PRI Bender bot that handles creating releases for the components and for the front-end library, and also publishing. So as soon as you merge one branch into another very protected branch, it goes out, it'll search all the commits, it'll find all the things that have happened, generate a release based off of the types of things that have happened, and then push those things live. So thankfully, adding all these different repositories, it does add some complications, but the process of going live is actually a lot more direct and simple. The other thing that I'll mention is that we had this one-off thing, right? This site that was running in React that was published on Now, but how do you actually pull that into Drupal, right? Because we don't want to just rebuild all that in Drupal. So what we did was we actually built a quick proxy for the homepage that pulls in the rendered value from the Now servers, and it just renders that. And that seemed to work quite well, actually. There are some gotchas around caching, but we'll talk about those in a minute. Beyond that, it was pretty flawless. So now we'll talk about the advantages and the challenges of this whole thing. We launched with a new homepage and API 1.0 in late April. And since then, there's been some lessons that we've learned and some good things that we've noticed about sort of our initial switch to this type of platform. And there's definitely some unique things that we've learned about taking a progressively decoupled approach, or just taking things one by one, dipping your toes in the water. So let's start with the advantages. It works, right? It doesn't just crash. Everything worked. It was an idea that we had, and it came to fruition. And it did actually, create a better-looking homepage that rendered much more quickly. And we were able to enter content into Drupal and have that process and validate cache and have that spit new data into the API and have that data in the API pulled into the new front end and then pulled back into Drupal. And all that worked pretty well. We, we sort of planned it out, architected it, and when we went live, cool. It really was kind of it works now. Cool. The front page was 40% faster. The time to byte or to first byte is less than half a second now, which is a absolutely significant increase over what they had previously. I think I think this number is actually kind of conservative, because there were times at which the site would be experiencing higher levels of traffic where you would take 13 to 18 seconds to load the homepage, which is just a long time. And the monolith is having to do things during that process. There's a reason it's taking time. Hey there. There's a reason it's taking time, and there's a reason that it's sort of spinning on its wheels. It's actually talking to the database. It's taking up resources. It's eating CPU power and taking up memory, right? So it's slowing down not only the homepage but other things that have to render and be processed, right? So that was greatly increased. One thing that we used was Pantheon's edge caching in conjunction with some caching stuff in RESTful to cache API results, and that actually worked quite well. So thanks to Pantheon for that edge cache. It's actually really great. We were able to mitigate quite a bit of risk in this process, I think, because we didn't replace the entire site, right? If you go live with an entirely new, fully distributed API-first, Drupal-powered thing, and you have 2 million people trying to look at your site in a couple of weeks, and you have a problem, it's going to be a little bit catastrophic, right? So you're going to encounter some problems. Everybody encounters problems. Whenever you go live, you're going to have some issues, right? So going live with so many things at the same time, that kind of compounds. You're going to have more issues, and so there's going to be definitely some what I would call fires to put out, and probably a lot of them. And so by doing this one thing at a time, we've mitigated that risk, or at least isolated the different things that can happen to one specific set of things, so that we at least know where to look, right, when things go wrong. And actually, as I mentioned previously, launching the homepage first allowed us to work through some caching issues. There were some timing issues with caches from the API, the now server, and the Drupal proxy. All those things have caching, so we had to make sure that those were timed correctly, and we also had to write some invalidation mechanisms to make sure that when editors publish new content that shows up on the homepage or publishes a new version of the homepage, that the cache is involved in defining that homepage are then invalidated, so that the API will update, the front end will update, and the proxy will pull those updates in. So we had to work through that. If it was the entire site, I can tell you this much, it would have been a lot more stressful for me to work through those problems. But it was just the homepage, so it wasn't so hard, and we had the time and the atmosphere necessary to approach those problems from a perspective of not, let me get this done immediately because the site is crashing and people can't see the pages they want to see, to like, oh, well, maybe 1% of our traffic would see a blank page occasionally. So now I can take a little bit more time and I can architect this a lot more elegantly, and I can create a correct solution to this problem. So take things one bite at a time. Don't try to eat a whole 5 hamburgers in one sitting. Eat a small bite of pizza instead, and then conquer things. Do the turtle thing, not the rabbit thing. One thing at a time. Go a little bit slower. Get it done right. There was no migration. Now, eventually there may be one, but there wasn't one initially for them to approach the idea of having a distributed platform, right? And so migrations are really hard and they're really time consuming. Who's done a migration here? They're a lot of work. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of just guts to kind of get it done and to get it done right, and to make sure that the content is really, really thoroughly migrated over and that it's really correct. And even still, when you migrate things, oftentimes years later, you'll find pieces of data that just didn't get migrated incorrectly, or something that's just a fragment of that migration process that you'll probably never get back. So it's time consuming, it's hard, and it's faulty. It's just, you will make mistakes and your data will be corrupted to a certain extent. You try to minimize that and make that as small as possible, but it's going to happen. So you want to avoid that. So in avoiding a migration, we were actually able to sort of stay on target in terms of budget and timeline. Approaching a migration would have been a much longer process. And Drupal 8 does come with better API design and architecture, tools around those things, API design and architecture. But the process of actually moving to Drupal 8 would have been crippling, absolutely crippling. The stakeholders would have been like, you built an API, great. Oh, you got to build this whole new front end system in Drupal 8. It looks the same, great. It's just, it's too long. It's too much time. Stakeholders need to see improvements, and the users want to see improvements. The business is growing. It's the consumer base is growing. So we need to make improvements now. And had we done a migration, that would not have been a possibility. This also sets us up to handle migrations in the future better, because meeting an API spec is a lot less difficult than building a bunch of panels things and views things and content models and migrations on top of all that stuff, right? So as opposed to just looking at every single piece of content and trying to pick all that stuff up and carry it over and then have, like really custom monolithic rendering rules and views and all that stuff. Now you already have a front end that requires a specific output for the API. The API is a contract between the back end and the front end. And as long as you can still meet that contract from a back end perspective, your front end will be fine. So you can completely restructure the back end while your front end can just do its thing, right? So, you could migrate to Drupal 8, make a 2.0 version of the API, and probably with a couple weeks of just changing, maybe a couple weeks, maybe less than that, of just changing API calls on the client side to make sure that new data structures are pulled in and the 2.0 API, that you've just published is consumable by this application. That's a lot easier to approach than just like migrating everything and rewriting everything. We were able to use modern frameworks. So now instead of having, like a weird like render arrays and PHP template and all this stuff, we have actually JavaScript, modern JavaScript, and those things are very robust. Facebook has been making some great contributions to React, and JavaScript has been growing really quickly in terms of providing really robust, good tools around developing things that are to be consumed by browsers, which, by the way, run JavaScript and sort of, natively are able to use it. So it kind of makes sense to be able to have your front end built in JavaScript, and these modern tools are phenomenal. One of the things that the PRI devs said, as the first time I think that this thing has been said for a long time, is that they really enjoyed working on the technical stack that they were working on. They really enjoyed working with the front end tools. Not heard that from them before, and I don't think that they had ever heard it either. So these tools are good. They provide ways to make robust, great front ends that look good, behave well, are accessible, are structured correctly, and also well tested and are manageable, right? And automated deployments and all this stuff, right? You get all these cool things, and they really liked it. They really liked the upgrade. It was like going from a 1973 Toyota Corolla that has no rubber on its tires to like maybe a modern day Land Rover. I don't know. The stakeholders were satisfied, right? They saw this new homepage. They saw that it was snappy, that it looked good, that it was responsive, accessible, all these things that they were looking for, and they saw that it was there. And Drupal the front end never really kind of got it right. There were always wacky things with it, but this new front end was very, very, very good. It looked great. It was robust. It was fast. Everything about it was just really, really, really nice, and they liked what they saw. And then on top of that, we told them we had a whole API behind it that was powering it, and they kind of conceptualized, they know what an API is, so they understand what they can kind of do with it. So that's just a huge bonus, right? We have a new thing, and we have a whole new set of endpoints that we can hit that allow us to distribute our data anywhere to anybody for any reason. So what are some challenges that we faced in this process during development, and also now that we've gone live with that initial homepage? Well, the first problem that you sort of encounter is that you have to support more code bases and more types of technology, right? So now you have this Drupal 7 site that's kind of sitting there, and you have to support that. You got to fix problems with that. To make changes to the API, you have to change that Drupal site. And then you also have to change these front end things, right? So you have a repository for the component library, a repository for the front end, and you have all these pieces that you sort of have to, manage. And that's fine, especially if you have like automated deployments and all those things that I was talking about. It really makes that a lot easier, but it's still a little bit more challenging because you have to brain switch between PHP and JavaScript if you're a developer on that project, right? And you just have to be generally more aware of what's going on, and you have to support more types of code. And so that definitely is a challenge. You're diversifying the requirements of your tech stack, so clearly that's going to introduce some complexities and challenges. The other thing is that this actually, it took a significant amount of time, and time is money, so a significant amount of money to build this initial thing. Honestly, we did it very quickly. We scoped out what this project should be in like mid-January. We were working on it by mid-February, and we had launched by like mid-April. So that's really fast to build out a whole bunch of API endpoints and a front end that's like robust enough to support that level of traffic. But that is a significant cost, especially if you didn't think you were going to do that in that fiscal year, right? In addition to that, now adding features is a little bit more difficult. Adding a panels page is really easy. Adding a route to a front end that now can, and then building components for that route, and then pulling them in and building the page from those components and the API, that's a much more, there's a lot more legwork to do code-wise than just like making a panels page. It's arguably better, and it definitely is what they want to move towards, because they want to move towards standardizing and consolidating and like having strict versions for their components and for their front end and that sort of thing. But it is more time to do certain small operations that would, in Drupal land just be clicking a button, pressing save, exporting a feature, and trying to push that live, right? So there's also a learning curve. The PRI team was primarily doing PHP work. They had done some work in Angular as well, but they really hadn't done anything in React or with Webpack or any of the tools that have kind of come to be the tools that people go to build modern JavaScript applications, at least today. JavaScript world changes so quickly, I tell you what. Yeah, so there was a learning curve. They had to figure out what React is, what JSX is, how to use these things. And we've tried to provide as much documentation as possible. But regardless, I mean, you still have to read documentation. You still have to understand it. And then you have to go and like figure out how to actually build things in these new environments. So they were able to overcome those learning curves very quickly. So I think that speaks a lot to their competency as a team and also to the documentation, the ease of use of the technologies that we were implementing. But still, you're introducing new things, and that is challenging. And then finally, prioritization became, or it is a little bit difficult, right? Because now you have a new homepage. Well, you're not going to stop there. You got this whole architecture in place for building more things and replacing your entire Drupal front end. So what's next, right? Is it stories? Do they want to attack the story pages that receives 90% of the traffic on their site? Or do they want to do something that's lower risk again and try to sort of test the waters in terms of doing multiple pages in this new front end? You know, so and what do stakeholders think of that stuff? Like, what do they want first? And what are the priorities of those different mechanisms that you're now going to transform to this new front end? Like, do you want it to be faster, or do you want it to look different, or do you want it to be done really quickly? What's going on? What are the priorities, and how do we go about actually meeting the requirements? So it requires further discussions around those things, and that's, you know, that's difficult, but it is progress, right? At least you're not just sort of letting Drupal 7 kind of sit there for a while, right? So that's all I have for you all today. Any questions?
I've got 2 or 3.
Go for it.
Who designed the site prior to you? Was it an agency, internal?
So so I've been working with PRI since 2015 personally, and at 4Kitchens. And I got onto the site when it had the design that I showed you earlier in the slide set. I'm not sure if you saw the original slide.
I did.
Oh, you did? Okay. I know that people were filtering in as I was talking.
So was that you? So you guys always had the site. Okay.
So no, we actually inherited the site from another agency. Palantir, I believe, did some work on it. So I'm not sure.
It was done by an agency. I didn't know it was an internal.
Yeah.
Second question: when you said we worked on it from January to April, 1, 2 people, 2.5.
Great question. So there were 2 people on their team. One, Brandon Hunt, the guy that does all the design work and did design these slides. He's their PO, and so he does a lot of like design and like vision things. Like, oh, this is where we need to be going. He understands the system, but he's not like super technical. He's a good front end developer, but he's not real back endy. So he was working on being a PO, and he really is a phenomenal PO. We wouldn't have been able to meet our timeline without him. Because
and then my last question. So you said that they had learned new technologies. How would you rate their competency? I mean, hadn't seen code, Rocket.
Sure. Yeah. So, so we have Brandon, right? He's not a super coder guy, but he does do front end things. So we exposed him to the React stuff, and he was able to get ramped up on that. They also had another developer that's a strong PHP developer. He was able to get ramped up on the React stuff as well. On 4Kitchens side of things, we had 3 developers: myself, and James Todd, and then Elvin Wilhite, the guy that I mentioned earlier, that has that blog post. Yeah, so we had a full team of 5 people, one of which is not really contributing code, and then obviously I was a tech lead on that project, so I have organization like things that I have to do. So I was writing a lot of code, but also kind of trying to manage things. So I think my output was a little bit lower as well.
4 people from your side, 1 or 2 or 3 from their side.
So 3 from our side and 2 from their side, and their competency was very much PHP, but they are coders. And so, Brandon is very comfortable with being a PO.
So your content contributors, did their experience change as a result of the changes that you made? You said that the site was going down, or as they were trying to, the editors were contributing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So when we did our stability sort of work on the Drupal 7 site, that did improve. When we migrated to Pantheon, that was a great improvement because now you have actual machines that can run your site during these higher levels of traffic or times in which you have higher levels of traffic. And so I think that was a great improvement for them. In terms of whether or not the actual API-driven part actually improved that experience, it did change it, especially for the homepage, because we restructured how we talk about defining what should be on the homepage, and we made that a lot more compatible with an API architecture, like the kind of output that an API wants to have. So that did change, but they found the changes to be fine. I expect that as PRI continues to go more decoupled and to distribute their architecture, that the editors will have more complications and potentially more things to learn because they're going to build a custom platform for the editors. So there'll be a whole process around that at some point in the future. But for now, they're still working in Drupal, and the experience is better, although not perfect.
Is the content that's consumed, the readers, are they web or are they mobile, or that shifting?
So yeah, that's a great question. So we have that's a really good question because there's a lot of answers to that. Actually, so about 50% of the people, I believe, don't quote me on that, but I believe 50% of the people that read PRI content do so from the PRI site. So that's desktop, that's mobile. I know we also have AMP, which is just another type of website. I think we did have FBIA working Facebook Instant Articles, but that was abandoned for some reason. I think it just didn't be what, there was no reason to do it. It just like wasn't a viable thing. And then they have like 60 RSS feeds that publish content to other places, including, but certainly not limited to, iTunes and other podcast resources. So there are many different ways to experience their content, and they're responsible for programs that you might not even know are related to them, like The World or Studio 360. Mm-hmm.
I have a question on tools.
Mm-hmm.
While updating what are the tools being used?
Sure. So we use the module by the name of RESTful, which, as I mentioned previously, is made by the same person that made the JSON API tools in Drupal. So they're like kind of similar in some ways, but not very congruent in terms of how they actually operate or how you develop against them. RESTful allows you to define resource classes, which define sort of like how an API interface should be constructed on top of an entity or a content type. And it provides some great like object-oriented interfaces around doing that. So it's pretty easy to use, although there are some bugs in it, some that we solved that we actually need to push back up. But yeah, it's a pretty great tool set. I would recommend it.
So your content editing, the content editors are working on essentially a production site, right? So when they edit and then when they save and publish, then that's available to the production API.
That's correct, yes.
So that site is subject to updates,
Mm-hmm.
your production site, but it's like a little different than having it like production facing.
No, so in terms of, okay, so I think I understand what you're saying. So
Because you have an editorial experience,
right,
that you're managing. Probably you have like updates to the site that are directed towards the editorial users,
mm-hmm.
right, which are not going to affect the output of the APIs, the structure of the APIs, right?
Right. Okay. So all of the APIs are based off of the content types that are within Drupal. So when you add new content or change existing content, that gets propagated immediately to the API. Even the caching layers are immediately invalidated and updated with the new content that you saved. So that process is very straightforward. When they actually do build their own editorial application that's not tied to Drupal's admin UI, that's going to be a little bit different of a process. But we did build out like all the different CRUD operations that you might have in an HTTP JSON API. So you can, if you're authenticated correctly, do post and patch and delete requests, and those operate in the same way that just saving an entity in a Drupal form. That's the same sort of operation as far as RESTful and Drupal are concerned. So you perform that request or save a form. It's the same thing as far as Drupal cares.
You do form submissions to the API.
You can. We do have one type of form submission that happens over the API. That's the contact form. But the rest of them are not really forms. They're kind of like requests, if you will. So if you do a GET request, I'll pull up the. Here we go. So this is the format of, or part of the format of the response that you might get from an API like the one that we built. You can also post this kind of data to the API to different endpoints, and Drupal will take the different fields and it will pull the data in, and it will update those fields based off of how it knows the property names map to the fields and that kind of thing.
In terms of user interaction with the site, like end user interaction.
It doesn't have, well, they're still using the Drupal admin UI.
I mean, the end user being the consumer interaction with people that are viewing the new site. Do they have other interfaces for them to submit forms back, form submissions, call to actions?
Sure.
Types of interaction that might normally be happen in Bootstrap, but now you're cross-site and API.
Yeah, totally. So like I said, we do have one endpoint that supports posting information to the API. It's just the contact us form. The rest of the site, as far as its consumers are concerned, are primarily read-only. So normal people can't do posts or patch requests against all but one of the endpoints. And the one endpoint that is open has a CAPTCHA validation process so that nobody can just spam it with a bunch of requests. So if you were to develop something that was a little bit more interactive in terms of allowing people to create or modify data that's in Drupal, there is something that you should definitely look at if you're going to use RESTful, which is there's an entity validation module that you can use. All the Drupal permission stuff is in core is extended to RESTful. So if you say editors of this role can modify this this content type, then that's true for the API as well. So all those rules are still followed, but the entity validation and field rules aren't directly applied. So if you're going to open that up, you definitely should use those tools. And we actually did use them here. So all the field settings that you have that require certain types of validation or formats, those things are immediately applied from the Drupal content type administrator interface to the data that's being worked with in the API. So if you say something that can't be over 12 characters long, the API won't let you add more than 12 characters, as an example. But that is an additional tool set that you have to sort of install and configure.
So, were you using Workbench moderation or anything to extend, published, non-published states?
Yeah, so the site PRI.org has been using Workbench for probably 5 years now. That was built in, and they've got a ton of revisions and stuff. We don't support loading revisions over the API. At some point, we will probably have to because we're going to build an admin UI, and people will need to interact with those revisions. But in terms of your normal users that'll be using this API to actually get access to PRI's content and read it or listen to it, they don't really need access to that, so we haven't exposed it yet. And in fact, I think once we do try to expose Workbench type of rules to editors, we may have to do some extension of RESTful itself as a tool set, because it really only operates on published or unpublished. So if something is published, it's available. If it's not published, it's not available. It doesn't matter what kind of user you are. There's no in-between state. So we might have to write our own plugin or maybe a piece of middleware that handles that sort of in between published or unpublished for certain users type of state.
On the back end, you do have other editorial states besides published and unpublished.
Yeah.
And so are you looking at that in Drupal 8 at this point, or are you just still Workbenches and core now? Right?
Yeah, I don't know what support JSON API in Drupal 8 land has for the Workbench stuff. I'm not sure if it supports it at all. I'd have to look that up, but I don't think they plan to migrate to Drupal 8 anytime in the near future. If they did, however, I'm sure that if those tools didn't provide access to that sort of moderation, on Drupal 8 JSON API stuff, we probably have to write handlers for that as well. I think. And just thinking about it, I wouldn't guess that JSON API handles Workbench stuff in core by default.
Last I heard, it doesn't.
Yeah, I think it doesn't. I don't even think it really handles versioning. There's no versioning in it at all. So there are some definite challenges to those existing things in Drupal 8.
So you guys have your 4 kitchens, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And so you guys have some kind of local dev standard that you use internally. So everybody's working on the same deck of cards.
Yeah. So we have adopted 2 things, Drupal VM and Lando. Drupal VM is the older of those 2 things, and it works pretty well, although it's not as seamless as Lando. Lando's a great wrapper for Docker that allows you to sort of have recipes on top of Docker, and Lando, yeah. Devwithlando.io. Chris might know. Is that the domain?
Yep.
Yeah, something like that.
Just look up Lando.
Lando on Google, yeah. It's a great way to do local development, and I think they try very hard to make containerized environments that are very consistent with what you might have in different production environments. So if for instance, Pantheon, they have a Pantheon recipe that you could just spin up. That's basically almost exactly what Pantheon would spin up. It's very, very close. So we've adopted that tool, I think, pretty wholeheartedly. There's some complications, but it's very, very easy to use.
So the JavaScript people on the other side, do they have to they just have their own level, whatever setup that they're using?
JavaScript's a whole different world because when you have Node at the right version installed, things just kind of work the same way.
They were just on their own.
Yeah, although we could use Lando to run Node boxes as well. It can do that very easily. So I wouldn't see any reason to do that right at this moment. But if you wanted to, there's nothing stopping you. Cool. Any other questions? Go for it.
Is it efficient enough for like a small project that you think you might kind of take this method of generating the REST API and the front end prior to a migration, right? Is it easy enough that would be a method if somebody asks you to migrate them from 7 to 8?
So you might just build a new interface against an API and then migrate to 8 and then build that.
Let us build your site first and then we'll migrate. Would that be an approach you would take, or would you just go for the migration?
I think it really depends on the requirements of the situation. I think like if they were like, yeah, we need a new front end now, and the Drupal front end is really messed up and all the content models are jacked up, and you need a way to like sort of cleanse the content model and reformat it and make it into an API that's a little bit more structured and maybe work through some of those problems and then write a consumer that you could then use, in conjunction with a Drupal 8 site as well. That would be a viable way. But I think, you'd have to communicate very clearly that the process of migrating to Drupal 8, from the front end perspective, it might not be that hard. Hopefully it's not that hard if you're smart about the way that you built the first API and built-in versioning and things like that. Migrating to Drupal 8 is going to be a big process probably, especially if it necessitates separating out the front end already. Like if it's that messed up and you can't like fix things and you just need to get off Drupal 7, probably, it's really circumstantial. And I think the only thing you can really try to do is evaluate how much time it's going to take to do something and whether or not you can get it done in that amount of time, and try to figure out where they're trying to actually go technically. Like, do they actually want to go to API driven? Because if you don't actually want an API and you're not trying to get your data out of Drupal beyond just making an initial like read-only like user front end, probably isn't smart to build an API because that's a lot of work, and maintaining it is a lot of work too. So if you need a monolith, build a monolith, but if you need to distribute your data everywhere and you have big plans for where you want that stuff to go, and you also need the stability of having these different applications and different environments handling different concerns, then that's the right thing to approach. Cool. Any other questions or anything? Well, rock on. Well, thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
And if anybody was listening online, thank you as well. And goodbye.